My name is Marco, and I'm writing to you from Estonia. We have a really weird town here called Kardla, where a lot of weird, scary stuff happened back in the 80s, and I think your viewers would be interested in hearing about it. I don't expect many of your American listeners to know where Estonia is, but that's not trying to clown on you guys, as they say. If you put a gun to my head and asked me to point to the state of Idaho on a map, I'd tell you to pull the trigger, and I'll never be convinced that Kalamazoo is a real place until I actually see it for myself. Now, my point being is that my geography of far-off places isn't all that great either. So allow me to explain where Estonia is and what we're all about. And to put it very simply, Estonia is situated in Russia's armpit. It's not so much the armpit part which makes that so bad, because if Estonia was situated in Margot Robbie's armpit, I think that would be fantastic. But instead, we're in Russia's armpit, with little Latvia to our south and freaky Finland to our north. They're freaks and they know it, don't worry about calling them out on it. We're a reserved, independent, and nature-loving people. And by that I mean, we're a bunch of emotionally distant loners who love long hikes where we drink vodka and complain about the weather. Estonians are so terrible about talking about their feelings that if I asked, "How are you?" and you replied, "I'm good, thank you," I would consider that a deep heart-to-heart conversation, as if you have laid out your entire soul to me. If Estonia sounds kind of like a weird place, then my job is done, because it is a weird place. It's always been a weird place because you have to be weird if you want to survive, especially when you're a tiny country trapped between the twin titans of Europe and Asia. But from what I understand, things got even weirder when the communists took over. Estonia was communist from the 1940s until 1991, and we tried our best to resist the Russians, but there were too many of them, and after they installed Estonian communists as our government, they started to ethnically cleanse us from our own country. They sent out lots of people to Siberia for a variety of crimes, some real, some imagined, whilst importing native Russians to try and change the demographics. We went from 97% native Estonian to only 62% native Estonian by 1989, and everyone either worked in the factories or was enlisted into the army, and we became second-class citizens in our own country. The secret police was everywhere. You couldn't even go to the beach without permission, and if you were caught watching anything but Russian TV, it was just like that guy in Parks and Rec saying, "Straight to jail." It was a terrible time for us, a time of hatred and paranoia, and the closer we got to independence, the more frustrated and volatile people became, and none more so than in a small coastal town known as Kardla. Kardla is the only town on the small island of Hiiumaa, which lies in the Baltic Sea. Most of the people there make their money from either fishing or tourism because there's a big nature reserve in the center of the island. But the third of Kardla's major industries is what's referred to in English as wrecking. Wrecking is basically when a team of divers strips a sunken shipwreck of anything valuable, and while it's not nearly as common as it used to be for coastal communities around the world, the waters around Hiiumaa were a hotspot for naval combat between Germany and Russia during World War II. There's a lot of money to be made in bringing back military salvage, but the practice caused a huge rift between Kardla's wreckers and its fishermen. The fishermen all said that disturbing the drowned sailors' final resting places would bring bad omens to Kardla, but then, especially during communist times, people were encouraged to dismiss such silly superstitions as relics of an oppressive past. The government then paid much better wages for wrecking than fishing, which further widened the rift between those two groups, and for a prolonged period, I'm talking many years, there was a general feeling in town that something bad would eventually happen. Either because of the hatred between the wreckers and the fishermen, because of the bad luck that the latter was bringing, or because of a third reason: the curse of the Hiiumaa witches. Now, I don't believe in this kind of thing, but it's worth mentioning because a lot of people around Hiiumaa do believe in it. And as we all know, believing can make a regular person do some very strange things. There's a local legend which says Hiiumaa used to be home to a coven of witches who would cast spells, shapeshift, or summon storms, especially to sink ships or cause bad luck to unwanted visitors. One story claims that many hundreds of years ago, a fisherman insulted a group of witches and they cursed his family. His descendants were then plagued by misfortune for generations, and since many of Cardla's fishing families were descended from this very same family, the witch's curse was often alluded to following the sudden and tragic loss of a local fishing vessel. Again, I don't believe in witches or giants or any stuff like that, but I do believe it's legends like that which contributed to what you might call Cardla's psychic earthquake. That might sound a little woo-woo to some, but I don't use the term in any kind of supernatural sense. What I mean is, all that tension in the region was like the fault lines in an earthquake zone. It kept building up, and when it finally got released, it was very bad. It all happened in the space of just 1 week, back in September of 1989. There's another reason to compare this to an earthquake, and that's how there was one big earthquake, then a handful of psychic aftershocks which followed, almost like echoes of the original incident. The first incident, the earthquake if you will, took place when a girl named Dasha Petrova blew up a Russian cafe by flooding the kitchens with gas and then igniting it. The explosion took place towards the end of service on a Saturday evening, so the restaurant was packed and the kitchen staff was in the dining area enjoying some hard-earned vodka after work. And by the time they smelled the gas, it was too late. And when all was said and done, 14 people ended up in a hospital, some with life-threatening injuries, and 5 more ended up in the morgue. The authorities were quick to blame anti-Russian sentiment and were ready to use it as an excuse to arrest dissident Estonians who were suspected of raising support for an independence movement. But when it was discovered that the perpetrator was none other than a 16-year-old Russian cocktail waitress, everyone in Kardla was stunned. Dasha had no history of violent or destructive behavior. By all accounts, she was quiet, fairly popular, and she did well in school. But what caused a well-behaved, unassuming schoolgirl to suddenly want to blow herself up and take as many people as possible with her? Police were still trying to figure out what the hell had happened, when just 2 days later, a Russian fishing boat worker swerved his car into a line of school children, all waiting for the bus to school. He was blackout drunk at 7:30 in the morning, and witnesses said it looked like he deliberately swerved into the kids after putting his foot down on the accelerator. The drunk must have knocked himself out after slamming into a wall because he stayed in his driver's seat until the police showed up to drag him out of it. But when they did, he was laughing. Everyone saw it too. The police, the medics, all the members of the public running around trying to save the kids' lives. They all saw it clear as day. Because when the drunk saw what he'd done, he started laughing so hard that you'd have thought that he was about to piss his pants. As they dragged him to the police car, the drunk was shouting, "Ondin, dva, tri, chitaire," which is Russian numbers counting from 1 to 4. He was counting the number of children that he hit that weren't moving or crying or screaming. He was counting the ones that were dead. As you can imagine, the residents of Kardla were in a state of shock. Within just 3 days, they had the restaurant explosion, then the 4 dead school children, and with many more injured. And the local medical clinic was completely full, so many of the kids had to be taken to the mainland for proper treatment. It was so shocking to people that it almost felt like a war had started. It felt like we were under attack from some unknowable force from the outside. But after the incident with the kids, people told themselves in typical Estonian fashion, well, now things can't get any worse, so it's all uphill from here. But then, things did get worse. There was a big funeral and vigil held for the school kids who lost their lives the morning that drunk decided to smash into them. Everyone in Kardla was in attendance, at least almost everyone. Because almost everyone being in the streets then walking to the cemetery together, it made it very easy to figure out who was and who wasn't there. And the more people started to notice that one particular family was missing, the more they started to ask questions, and the more they started to become concerned. A small group of people then went to check in on the absent family, only to make a truly terrible discovery. A boy of just 11 had convinced his little sister of around 7 to join him in murdering their mother and father. They woke up early, Then, while their parents were still in bed, they crept downstairs to their kitchen and retrieved a pair of very sharp kitchen knives. Then they walked back upstairs into their parents' bedroom, then cut both their throats while they were still sleeping. Obviously, people don't just die if you cut their throats, especially if you don't get all the major blood vessels. So instead of pumping out blood so fast that they were too weak to move or scream, the kids' parents tried frantically to both stop the bleeding and to stop their children from attacking them. But sadly, their efforts were in vain. They found the mother's corpse in the bathroom and the dad's in the kitchen downstairs. He'd passed out and died trying to reach the phone to call 03, which back then was the Soviet emergency number specifically for medical emergencies. And this marked the third incident of multiple murders within just a week. Then instead of telling each other, "Cheer up, things can't get any worse," people began to wonder what the next thing would be. They went from shocked and saddened, but still stoic, to almost a full-on panic descending on their town. People wouldn't let their kids go to school. They refused to go to work or do anything remotely dangerous. It was like people were convinced that there was some kind of curse on the town, which there obviously wasn't, but that didn't matter. Because if people believe something, they truly believe it, then they can act in all kinds of ways you never expect them to. The wreckers started to throw back some of the more valuable and precious things they'd kept from the great sunken graveyards they'd made their money from. They threw back medals, trinkets, all kinds of things, and in the middle of the night, some men walked out of their houses and tossed their trophies in the cardless harbor and watched them sink to the bottom, all in hopes that it would put the dead sailors' angry spirits to rest. Some of the fishermen, on the other hand, left offerings in the woods for the witches of Hiuma, who they firmly believed were behind all the horrifying goings-ons. It was like the vast majority of the people in town all fell victim to this sudden, all-consuming and collective madness, one that made them lash out at each other and act in all kinds of bizarre ways. They kept waiting and waiting for the next terrible thing to happen, but thankfully for them, the psychic storm hovering over the town had finally abated. Again, I don't use that term in the literal sense, but to me, it's the only term that actually broaches on what happened during that 1 week back in 1989. Kardla went from years and years without so much as a common assault, and then during the space of just 7 days, a dozen people all lost their lives in a series of senselessly violent acts. It's almost enough to make a person believe in restless spirits or ancient Wiccan curses. But if you ask me, what's to blame is something that's in our programming as biological machines, lines of code we've been running since the days we lived in caves and the shadows cast monsters on the walls during long and uncertain nights. Without a doubt, the biggest scandal to ever hit my small Arkansas town was one summer, a 9th grade girl ended up in the hospital after being attacked while walking home from school. Whoever attacked her hadn't just beaten the crap out of her, they'd violated her to the point that she needed actual surgery to repair the damage. The doctor who performed the surgery broke down into tears during the press conference afterwards. It was his job to tell everyone the good news that the surgeries had been successful and her life had been saved, and he still broke down into tears. Obviously, the next phase was trying to find the guy who did it. The victim's memory of the incident was hazy, and she couldn't give a detailed description of her attacker, and so the whole town descended into this total state of paranoia trying to figure out who it was. State police were running the investigation while local cops were going door to door or making visits to local schools to make appeals for information, and it was a very intense time. We'd never known anything like it either. Someone's getting a speeding ticket around here, and it's all people are gossiping about for maybe weeks, wondering where they'd been speeding to or who they were speeding from. So to go from low crime to woe crime, well, that was quite something. Everyone was praying the attacker would be found and that they'd be found fast. And then out of the blue, a local pastor walked into his 17-year-old son's bedroom and shot him point blank in the head. It was his wife, the boy's mom, who called the sheriffs on him, and she was still there screaming bloody murder when the deputies showed up to arrest him. The pastor didn't resist. He just let those boys cuff him, and then he walked with them to their cruiser and off he went. And down at the department, the guy made a full confession, told them the whole chain of events too. He and his boy had been talking and had come to a disagreement. The pastor then walked downstairs, took a pistol out of his gun safe, and then walked back upstairs and shot him. He told them what gun he used, the caliber of the bullet, everything except why he did it. The deputies asked him over and over what it was he and his boy disagreed over and why it was so bad the pastor felt he had to shoot him afterwards. But no matter how many times they asked, no matter how many times they phrased the question or threw out guesses, the pastor wouldn't say what caused it. He simply repeated that he did it and asked to be taken to jail. Officially speaking, no one knows why the pastor killed his boy, just over a week after that 9th grader ended up in the hospital. But off the record, we all know why, and it's the reason the girl's attacker was never caught. The only thing that really remains a mystery to everyone is how the pastor found out, because outside of a straight-up confession, it's hard to imagine how a father might come to learn something like that from his own flesh and blood. There's a lot of speculation around here, some of it good-natured, a lot of it not so good-natured, but it also doesn't seem to bother people that they'll never know how the pastor figured out his boy was the one that attacked that little 9th grade girl. Because however it happened, some folks around here are very much of the opinion that the pastor did the right thing in putting his boy down. In late August of 1996, when I was just 19 years old, I arrived home to find my mom sitting at the kitchen table. I'd been at a house party with my then girlfriend the night before, and following one of my first real experiences with alcohol, I wasn't feeling my best. I walked through the front door into a house so quiet that I thought my mom and sister were elsewhere, but when I walked into the kitchen, I saw my mom just kind of sat there, very silent with a glass of wine in front of her. It was so unexpected, and I was so hungover that seeing her actually made me jump a little. But then, that feeling of surprise was quickly replaced by one of dread. Mom never drank in the daytime, and she never just sat around the kitchen table, quiet like that. And so very likely I started to suspect that I might be in for some very bad news. She asked me to sit down, and when I did, she told me that my dad was gone, and that he wasn't coming back. I asked if gone she meant dead. When Mom shook her head and told me no, he just left, I remember floating on an island of relief for a moment, before sinking back into a sea of shock. And once I was able, I followed up with a ton of questions asking how she knew, where he'd gone, when he'd left, and stuff like that. And the short answer to all of them was she didn't know, and the harder she tried to come up with any substantial response, the more upset she got. He hadn't warned her, he hadn't left a note, he just packed a suitcase, got into his car, and then drove off to God knows where. The conversation ended with my mom crying and me hugging her while I told her everything was going to be okay. But as I unfortunately came to discover, everything was not going to be okay. For the first 2 or 3 months, no one really talked about my dad leaving. There were routine calls and visits from relatives to check in on us, but the discussions focused on our welfare, not why Dad had left or if he'd be back. Anything further than that, anything which rubbed up against the mystery of the whole situation, tended to upset Mom to the point that she couldn't talk about it anymore, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't feel the same way. But then, after letting the shock fully wear off, all the pain and grief was replaced by a burning curiosity, and one which was only made worse by my mom's deliberate and enduring silence on the subject. She wasn't in denial or anything, and people grieve in different ways, but whenever I brought up the subject of my dad, she'd either start crying or get super angry and start yelling stuff like, "You don't talk to me about that piece of crap. He's dead to me." And I had no choice but to seek answers elsewhere, and since I strongly suspected that Mom was hiding something from me, I did so with great intensity. My first move was to contact one of my dad's friends, his only real friend in fact, who I figured was the most likely to have knowledge of his whereabouts. Dad was an only child, and both his parents died before he was 30, but he and his friend Carl had been close since their college days together, which is even longer than he'd known my mom. I thought if anyone knew where my dad was, it'd be him, but when I called him, he said that my call was the first that he'd heard of it. He had no idea why my dad might have left, but he did know a few places that he might have gone, and one of those places was a small town up in the wilds of northern Canada named Wrigley. I managed to rule out the prospect that he'd stayed in Portland because he wasn't going to his job anymore. I then tried his hometown of Lincoln City, but as far as I could tell, he wasn't there either. Then and only then did I consider traveling all the way up to Wrigley, the furthest of the 3 potential locations, because doing so would mean driving for 30 hours straight through some of the most remote areas of the Canadian wilderness. And Carl said my dad had spent a summer there back during his college years and frequently reminisced about it. He'd also mentioned wanting to go back there one day, so according to Carl, there was a good chance that if he had indeed suffered some kind of sudden midlife crisis, he'd traveled up to Wrigley. Wrigley, which is just over 450 miles from the nearest big city, has a population of around 100, mostly First Nation citizens. It has 1 gas station, 1 medical clinic, and the nearest RCMP office is over 200 miles away. It is the very definition of a small town. But to me, that was good news, because there'd be nowhere for my dad to hide. I was warned against any kind of winter travel because it can reach -60 up there during the winter months, and so instead I made sure to drive up in the summertime. I arrive in Wrigley on Wednesday, July 22nd of 1998, after 3 days of driving up from Portland. The nearest motel was over 100 miles away, but since I was only planning on staying in town for around 48 hours at the most, I figured I could just sleep in my car, which inadvertently brings me to my first stop in town, the gas station. Wrigley's 1 gas station was staffed by a guy I remembered named Winston, and Winston was a great guy who looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, and we made small talk at first, and he remarked about how rare it was to get any outsiders coming through. That gave me a golden opportunity to ask about my father, so I did, while showing him the most recent photo that I could get my hands on. Winston didn't recognize him from the most recent photograph, but he did recognize someone in the second picture I showed him, which I fished out of all the possessions my dad left behind. It showed a much younger, college-age version of my dad, along with a similarly aged woman. Both were dressed in hiking gear and were standing on either side of a large rock, pointing at what appeared to be some kind of mineral deposit running all the way through the center. Winston recognized it as Hunter's Rock, a landmark about 10 miles outside of town. It had been kind of famous back in the 80s because some geologists had come up from Vancouver to take a look at it, and local legend said that it was the spear of some ancient gargantuan hunter that had become embedded in the earth when they missed their intended target. And this gave rise to rumors that Hunter's Rock was some kind of meteorite that had indeed buried itself deep into the earth after falling from the stars. The geologist's arrival caused quite a stir in town because, while many were excited to learn the truth of the rock's origins, others believed applying such scientific rigor would be disrespectful to the beliefs of their ancestors. The rock turned out not to be any kind of meteorite, nor was it the gigantic spear of some titanic hunter of yore. But interestingly enough, the geologists estimated that it did extend deep into the earth, potentially for almost a mile, and unless the area was actually some kind of extinct volcano, he had absolutely no clue how it had gotten there. I say all this because I was very interested to know why my dad had visited the place. I didn't remember him having any kind of interest in geology, but then again, he might have figured seeing that it was just something to do while he was in the area. But then, after Winston filled me in on Hunter's Rock and I showed him the pictures one more time, he started staring intently at the girl in the second picture. He asked if I knew who she was, and when I said no, he asked if it was okay if he took the picture into the back while he made a phone call. He proceeds to tell me that, with about 80% certainty, the girl in the photograph was the same one that had gone missing back in the early 70s out near Great Bear Lake. He said that there were some people that I should check with to be 100% sure, but that her face was remarkably similar to the one that he'd seen on missing posters back when he was a kid. I then asked him who he needed to talk to, in order to be certain, and he told me that I needed to visit the local government office, which was inside of the town's medical clinic. Since I arrived in the very late afternoon, the office would be closed until the following morning, so after Winston wished me luck in finding my dad, I took a walk around town and then headed back to my car. The next morning, I walked over to the gas station to get some coffee and breakfast and swapped small talk with Winston before heading over to the clinic. There, I met with Irwin, chief of the Pedzaki First Nation, and while that sounded like an awfully grand title, he told me he felt like little more than a clerk at times and that his title was almost purely ceremonial. He was a welcoming and generous man, and the moment I met him I just knew that he'd be willing to help. But unfortunately, Chief Irwin had some bad news to share with me. The chief, who operated out of an office of the size of a broom closet, was happy to welcome a rare visitor into town, and assuming I was some kind of tourist, offered to answer any and all questions I had. He even offered to set me up with a guide who'd take me around the area in an off-roader so I could see all of his tribal lands from the comfort of a passenger seat. But when I told him my story, as in that I was looking for my dad, his face softened. Then when I showed him the second picture, the one from what I assumed were his college days, I'll never forget how the chief reacted. He went from happy and smiley to having a look so cold it almost scared me, and then he simply said, "I think you and me should step into my office." Now it might sound morbid to some, but I was excited. He was clearly in possession of some valuable information, the exact thing that I'd driven more than 1,500 miles for. But what he told me raised many more questions than it answered. Chief Irwin told me that the girl in the picture was named Susan Calvert and was a King's University graduate who disappeared in the summer of 1973. But then he pointed to my dad and told me that he'd been one of the potential suspects arrested by the RCMP, and that he'd been questioned in connection with Susan Calvert's disappearance not once, but twice. Obviously, that was all very shocking, and again, this might make me sound like a kind of psycho, but it was progress. Solid progress for the first time in literally 18 months. Everywhere I'd gone, everyone I'd turned to, it had all been dead ends. So even if it was bad news that my dad had potentially been a murder suspect, it was still something solid to cling to, which gave me an idea on why he might have left us in the first place. I mean, think about it. You're in college, you head up to Canada for a summer hiking vacation, you meet a girl, maybe fall in love, but that girl ends up going missing, and you're one of the suspects. That'd be just about enough to screw anyone up for life. I mean, provided you weren't the cause for her disappearance. So by that point, it seemed highly probable that Dad had made a late-life pilgrimage back to Wrigley to get answers about the girl he'd loved and lost. That last point kind of circles back to why I was so suspicious Mom was hiding something from me. She was so upset, then so angry at my dad, and it made me think that she knew something about this girl Susan, and that my dad's sudden disappearance might be connected to her own. Chief Irwin went on to tell me that Susan Calvert's remains had never been found, so no one had ever been charged in connection with her disappearance. But he also mentioned that her last known location was in the jaws of Great Bear Lake, out in what are known among the tribes as the Sawtooth Lands. And that was where the Mounties had found her campsite, totally abandoned but also totally undisturbed. He took a good look at the more recent picture of my dad before telling me that he hadn't seen him, but the chief was also quick to add that if Dad had been heading straight toward Hunter's Rock, there was no real reason for him to stop back in town, especially if it was a place that held the bad memories of being arrested. If he wanted to really look for the missing girl, or even if he just wanted to pay his respects at the place that she was last seen alive, it made sense that he went straight up to the Great Bear Lake, at least if he was up there in Canada and not someplace else entirely. And the only issue was getting there. From Wrigley, it was about a 200-mile drive to get to a place called Deline, and if you didn't have a decent 4x4, which obviously I didn't, then there was no point trying to make the drive. But even if I did have one, I was still looking at a 30-mile hike out into the marshlands through all kinds of crap and mosquitoes, yes, they still have them up there, to the place Susan Culvert's campsite was found. I could go through the process of hiring a 4x4, driving up to Deline, then hiking for 3 days through some pretty hellish terrain, and it could end up being for nothing. Granted, I considered it all a very noble pursuit. There was literally nothing more important to me than trying to find my dad and potentially bring him home. But like any great effort, the spirit was willing, yet the flesh was weak, and in my case, my bank account was even weaker. I simply couldn't afford to extend my stay by another few days, as I'd already taken a whole week off of work and had spent a ton of money on gas, motel rooms, and road food. It was either throw in the towel or call Mom and beg her to transfer some money into my account. I'd then have to call work and risk getting fired after begging for a few extra days off, when I'd already put my manager in a pretty bad bind by requesting a week off at relatively short notice. And calling it quits, and then maybe heading back at a later date, seemed like the logical course of action. Being up there in the Northwestern Territories made me feel like I was close, you know what I mean? So close that I could practically feel him up there with me somehow. Then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no turning back, not unless I wanted to live with the regret of inaction for the rest of my goddamned life. But the thing that really sealed it was when Chief Irwin told me that Deline had an RCMP office, and how that was the place they'd questioned my dad after his friend Susan disappeared. They'd have records, written reports, everything I needed to get more information about what had happened to her and my dad. And with that in mind, I called work, and then I called my mom. Now, getting the time off was easy because I was just honest with my manager and told him what I was doing. My dad had left, we were worried about him, so I was off looking for him in the hopes of bringing him home and, hell, maybe even saving his life too. And at that, my manager said, "Take all the time you need." Mom, on the other hand, was not so easy to convince. She didn't know where I was or what I was doing, so when I called her and informed her of the situation, she was not happy. At first, in light of what I was doing, she refused to wire me any money and told me to return home immediately. I had to argue with her for about a half hour straight using the phone in the Wrigley gas station's office before she finally relented and agreed to send me some money. I'd be lying if I said that it didn't get a little tearful at points, and I'll be forever grateful to old Winston for giving me my privacy during that phone call. It was quite possibly one of the most intense I've ever had. I also owe Winston in another way, an even bigger one too, because it was he who agreed to drive me all the way up to Deline near Great Bear Lake in exchange for nothing but gas money. And I guess he was pretty invested in my little story by that point, especially once I shared what I'd learned from Chief Irwin. But before we set off the next day, he told me that he wouldn't be following me out into the marshes. I told him that I wasn't expecting him to, and how I wasn't 100% decided on whether or not I was headed that far anyway. But then he said something that sticks with me to the day I die. He asked, "If your dad's out looking for the girl, and you're out looking for him, who's going to end up looking for you? You ever think about that?" And I remember those words, and I hadn't. I'd never even paid one single iota of thought towards that concept. But when I did, in the moments after Winston asked me, it chilled me to the bone. On the drive up to Deline the next day, Winston managed to completely talk me out of walking 30-plus miles into the marshes. If my dad was out there, and he hadn't gone completely crazy, then he would have had at least some basic camping gear with him, whereas I didn't even have a tent, let alone enough camp food or the right footwear to make it through 30 miles of marshy wilderness and back, and so realistically, there was no going after my dad in the Sawtooth lands. But what I could do was check in with the RCMP up in Deline, let them know about the situation with my dad, and then give them my contact details so they could get in touch if there were any sightings of him. And maybe, just maybe, someone up there would be able to tell me more about why my dad was arrested in connection with his friend's disappearance. It took us about 5 hours to get up to Deline, and then when we arrived, Winston drove us straight over to the RCMP office, which thankfully was right next to a grocery store. He said he'd pick us up some sodas and hot food, and then I headed into the office alone. The office was just a small reception area with a larger room behind it, and after looking through the open doorway, I traded greetings with a younger-looking red-coated Mountie. Constable Jacobs, who was around my age, seemed only too happy to help me. But when he realized that I had more than just a basic inquiry in mind, he told me to sit tight while he radioed the only other Mountie in Deline, a man named Mackenzie, not his real name, and the need for the pseudonym will shortly become clear. Mackenzie, who was considerably older than his junior coworkers, seemed far more equipped to help with inquiries of a historical nature, and he did help. He was a little frosty with me at first, but after I told him the whole story about looking for my father, he warmed up enough to talk to me. Mackenzie actually remembered the incident involving Susan Calvert and my father because he'd been a junior constable way back in the 70s at the time of the investigation. He remembered my dad stumbling back into Deline on his own. He remembered how it was he who had reported Susan missing, and he also remembered how, following the initial round of questioning, the Mounties basically had no choice but to consider my dad as a suspect. Mackenzie hadn't been present for either interview, so all he knew was that my dad had somehow implicated himself, but that's all he knew. They had all the files and reports on site, but Mackenzie said he couldn't share them without the proper clearance, and that might only come after a lengthy Freedom of Information request. If he had showed me the files, he might actually lose his job, and as he put it, he hadn't worked just shy of his 30 years only to lose his pension after a little snafu like that. It was frustrating, but also strangely cathartic. I kind of hoped that they might just show me the files in a back room or something, but I guess that was purely wishful thinking on my part. Filing out a FOIA request might take months, but to me, it was just another step on what had already been a long journey of tracking down my dad. I'd been searching for like 18 months by that point, and I sure as hell could have waited a little longer, and even though I traveled all that way, I knew I wasn't going home completely empty-handed. Mackenzie and Constable Jacobs both promised to keep an eye out for my dad, and even promised to call me if they'd heard or saw anything out there in the jaws of the bear. And by that, I mean the marshlands where Susan Calvert went missing. And before I left, Mackenzie asked what my plans were. I told him I was heading back to Wrigley, and I would probably spend another night in my car before heading south in the morning. He wished me luck, and I thanked him, and then I walked outside to meet Winston near his truck. He picked us up some sandwiches, and then as we got on the road back to Wrigley, I gave him the lowdown on what the Mounties had told me. Winston said that he'd been keeping me in his prayers, hoping that I'd get my hands on those interview tapes sooner rather than later. I wouldn't say that I was a religious person, not by any stretch, but sometimes, just sometimes, I think Winston's prayers found someone's ears. Because that night, as I was trying to get as much rest as possible prior to my drive back south, I woke up to hear someone knocking on the glass of my car's window. Then when I looked outside and saw a distinctive red jacket, I realized who it was. It was Mackenzie, the Mountie from up in Deline. I lifted my seat up, opened my car door, and he asked if he could come sit in the passenger seat, and I told him sure. Then when he climbed inside, I remembered that he reached into his pocket and produced a cassette tape with a scribbled label. I couldn't read it right away. I had my internal lights switched off so I wouldn't kill my car's battery and be stuck out there. But I had a strong feeling it was something very specific, something he definitely should not have been showing me. Mackenzie told me to turn on my car's tape player, and so I did, and then after he slid the tape into the slot, my suspicions were confirmed. It was the tape with my dad's first interview on it, the one from before he was arrested. Since he wasn't considered a suspect during the first police interview, my dad was very forthcoming with certain pieces of information. And as it turned out, he and Susie, as he called her, were out camping near the marshlands when Susie got up in the night to go pee outside the tent. After Susie's exit woke him up, my dad had simply rolled over and attempted to go back to sleep. But just seconds later, he heard Susan Calvert scream. Dad said that he rushed to put his boots on, grabbed a flashlight, and then ran out into the night to see what had scared Susan so badly, and that according to him, is when he saw them. One of the interviewing Mounties asked my dad who they are, and my dad responds by saying that if he tells them, they'll think he's crazy. Dad then says something about how, if he knew they were out there, he and Susie wouldn't have gone anywhere near the place, not in a million years. One of the Mounties then asked my dad where they took Susan Culvert, and Dad said he didn't know, but wherever it was, he knew Susie was probably dead. She had to be, because there was no way that she could survive what they were doing to her. Again, one of the Mounties asks who they are, and Dad explodes. He asks one of them, "How do you guys not know? You live out here," and all this other unhinged sounding stuff. Like, it's no wonder the Mounties assumed that he murdered Susan Culvert, because he really did sound out of his goddamned mind. The Mounties asked a few more questions, but with each answer my dad kept getting more and more agitated. He didn't know why they didn't take him too. They hadn't seen anyone following them over the previous few days, and he couldn't explain why there wasn't a drop of Susan's blood anywhere, despite my dad's claim that they were violently attacking Susan. And after that, the Mounties announced that they were terminating the interview and the tape went dead. When I asked Mackenzie if he'd brought the second tape, he shook his head and told me it wasn't worth listening to. And based on what my dad had said during his first interview, the Mounties placed him under arrest on suspicion of Susan Culvert's murder. Remember, my dad said that he knew for certain that she was dead, but then put him through a second round of questioning. But the reason it wasn't worth listening to is because my dad totally stonewalled the two Mounties asking him questions. When he figured that they might at least partially believe his story, my dad was very chatty. But then, once he realized that he was a murder suspect, he did the smart thing and didn't say another word until he was released due to lack of evidence. Mackenzie said that after he was released, my dad left town, but the search for Susan Culvert continued for another 10 days, and the search and rescue team found the campsite that she'd shared with my dad, but they didn't find any trace of the girl herself. No clothes or blood or human remains, and the search effort was eventually called off, and many years later, her parents had her declared dead for some sort of legal purpose, and she was taken off the missing persons register up there in Canada. But according to Mackenzie, there was something in the files that caught his attention. At one point, towards the end of the search, a dog from an RCMP's search team ran off and was never seen again, and the dog's disappearance sparked a whole new search and rescue operation, a kind of mini-search within the larger effort. Mounties searched high and low for this missing hound as well as Susie Culvert, but neither of them were ever recovered. Mackenzie said the dog's disappearance was eventually put down to an operational hazard and it was mourned and then replaced. But he thought that there was a lot more to it than just a dog getting a little overexcited and then drowning in a marsh. Remember, they never found Susan's body or the remains of that dog, in which case, where the hell did they go? Mackenzie finished by saying that, in his opinion, my dad and Susie Culvert had come across some kind of grow site, either marijuana, opium poppies, or maybe both. And he was quick to add that he had absolutely no proof of that theory, but very little else explained some of the comments my dad made during that first interview. After I expressed my gratitude for bringing me the tape, Mackenzie left and left me to an uneasy sleep. It was weird hearing my dad that young, though. He sounded a lot like me whenever I heard my own voice on tape. But that's obviously not what stuck with me that night. It was what he'd said during that first interview, along with how he'd said it. Now, driving back, I had these strange mixed feelings of sadness and fear. I'd never felt so close to finding my dad, and at the same time, he'd never felt so distant. All his life, he'd probably been dealing with the aftermath of what had happened up in the Northwest Territories, and I can't speak for my mom because I still don't know to what extent she knew all of this, but personally, I had no idea. And that was almost 2 years ago, and at the time of writing, now this is in April of 2000, I'm still no closer to finding out the whole truth about my dad's disappearance. But these days, I have a much better idea of where to look, and Now that I can hold my own on a solo hiking trip, I think I'm just about ready to go looking for him. I'm planning on heading back up to Deline in the summertime sometime, possibly in June, and I'll be sure to write up everything I find. I don't know how many of you will actually read this, but I don't care. This is good for my sanity, and when I find out anything else, this will be the first place I post to. I imagine that I'll be posting another blog in a few months, and if I don't, I either found my dad or something else happened. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, you are loved.